Hi, everyone, and welcome to Valley of Depth, a podcast from Archaea Media. Archaea builds media brands around the critical technologies shaping national security. We do this through Payload, which covers the space industry, Ignition, which covers nuclear energy, and Tectonic, focused on defense tech, through journalism, events, and original research. Valley of Depth, we're going deeper, talking to founders, investors, policymakers, and military leaders who are building and shaping some of the most complex and consequential technologies in the world. Today, I'm joined by Jordan Bramble, co-founder and CEO of Antares, a company building microreactors designed to bring reliable, portable nuclear power to remote and demanding environments on Earth and eventually beyond it. We talk about the state of the nuclear fission industry, what's driving a resurgence in interest, how Antares is approaching one of the most challenging technical and regulatory problems in energy, and much, much more. Before we dive into today's episode, a quick word about Payload Pro, our premium subscription for deep dive space industry insights, analysis on trends, and exclusive research you won't find anywhere else. Each week, we go beyond the headlines with original reporting, investor perspectives, and detailed financial models. Recent topics include SpaceX's projected 2025 financials, Kuiper's business economics, and the resurgence of satellite manufacturing. We also just published our first report, The Case for Space, a 50-page investor's guide to the space economy. If you're in the business of space or just want to understand it like an insider, subscribe now at pro.payloadspace.com. That's pro.payloadspace.com. Jordan, after a very long time, I finally convinced you to come onto the show. So welcome.
Hey, Mo, thank you for having me.
No, it's great to have you. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about Antares and all the great things that you're doing for the industry. But before we jump right into that, I do want to start off with the macro because it's important to kind of level set, especially given that there have been a few recent changes in the industry, particularly with how the administration is viewing the industry. But let me kind of ask a broad question. So where from your perspective is the nuclear industry today, specifically fission? We're going to be talking about fission today. And where do you see it heading?
We're sort of at this nascent precipice right now where we as a country, as America, we have several test reactors that are now a couple of years from being turned on. Some of those are actually privately funded reactors, us included. We recently, within the last couple of weeks, had a series of presidential executive orders signed by the president that are really meant to accelerate the deployment of nuclear energy in the U.S. and recognize that nuclear energy is a national security matter, which is frankly one of the reasons why we started this business at Antares. So, this is the best time to be working in nuclear, to be investing in nuclear. I used to say it was the best time in a half a century, but now I think it's actually the best time ever. Now, it's not all rosy, right? One of the huge issues that I think will define this industry over the next decade is we're lagging behind China pretty substantially, right? And much of the progress that they've made in the recent years was really built off the back of intellectual property research and R&D that we did here in this country at our nuclear energy labs.
How much of the renewed interest is driven by sort of those geopolitical factors versus actual climate change goals? Like, now ultimately there is a climate change aspect or a sustainability aspect of all of new energy technologies. But how do you, what do you think, how is nuclear viewed today from that regard?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just say, I love that question because the essence of it is partly what makes this such a special opportunity in nuclear. So there's this renewed bipartisan consensus with nuclear where the majority of people are now in favor of nuclear energy. I am in the halls of Congress at least once a month, and I always like to joke, a lot of the times I couldn't tell you if I'm talking to a Democrat or Republican because there's just such a consensus around this issue right now. And the reason nuclear energy now has such a universal appeal is in part because we recognize that it must be a part of the solution to climate change. At the same time, our ability to deploy nuclear energy has great national security implications, both in our race with China across several strategic domains, our ability to field emerging capabilities, next generation warfighting systems. And there's a space side of this as well, where our ability humanity's ability to expand its presence into space, both for military aspirations, but also to ultimately have a commercial economy in space, is going to depend on our ability to harness power, and nuclear power will absolutely be a part of that. So people have just recognized this new mass appeal for nuclear.
So I'm going to throw out an acronym that's been being used a lot: SMRs, so small modular reactors, which are effectively larger reactors but modularized and smaller, to use the word itself, and of course microreactors. There's obviously your company, which you'll talk about, fits into that kind of micro. Well, I'll let you define it yourself. But there's microreactors, there's SMRs, but then there's obviously what powers, what makes up, I think, 20% of electricity generation in the U.S., which is traditional gigawatt scale power plants. Do you think that sort of this movement is about SMRs and microreactors replacing or supplementing traditional gigawatt scale plants?
So I really don't believe that these technologies are in competition with each other. I think it's pretty clear that they solve different problems. And I think, unfortunately, there's a public discourse within the nuclear industry that often pits microreactors and SMRs and grid scale nuclear against each other. And I think, unfortunately, one of the things that drives that is, it's really the microreactor developers that are raising private capital right now. And I think that's a symptom of the fact that the traditional gigawatt scale nuclear is not really a fit for venture capital, private equity financing. And, in the project finance markets, people just aren't really willing to take first of a kind risk, seemingly. Maybe that's changing as we see some of the hyperscalers start to step up. But, for us, we really believe these technologies are not in competition with each other. I want to see more nuclear power deployed on the grid. I also think microreactors, like what we're working on, have special use cases that they can solve that large nuclear couldn't solve, right? And one of the things that we're trying to do differently here is actually fund iterative testing of test reactors so that we can mature the product enough so that it can be cited with a customer. We're funding that primarily with a mix of venture capital and public capital dollars.
Do you think nuclear is still a controversial topic?
I almost feel like there's like a meme around this issue where we first got started in 2023, so we're a relatively young company. We've been moving pretty fast. But I remember in the beginning, I would meet people who would say, you just hear all these people say, I'm such a huge fan of nuclear, but unfortunately it has like a bad public perception. The public's not in support of it. But everybody basically says that. So the question then arises, well, who are the people that aren't actually in favor of it? Because I haven't actually come across any of them. And I think the polling data actually shows this. So, as of 2025, several polls have been conducted that show, public support for nuclear energy is now above 60%. That's actually the highest it's been at any point in the existence of nuclear energy. And that support is heavily stratified by age. So in other words, as you go further down the age demographics, people are actually increasingly supportive of nuclear energy. So we expect that support to continue to grow in the coming years. And, fundamentally, I think people fear, what is kind of rare and poorly understood. So, nuclear power plant accidents almost never happen in about a century. There's been a single digit number of them. How to think about the risk and the consequence is just not well understood in the public discourse. And so, it leads to a fear. But, automobiles, commercial aviation, we understand the risks much better with these things. We have more of a mental model for what a catastrophe actually looks like. And people don't fear it as much, right? The reality is these technologies, especially the advanced reactors like what we're working on, are passively safe. Safety is part of the design process itself.
Right. Have you seen the show Chernobyl?
I have. It's been several years since I've watched it.
So,
cinematically very good, but there's a lot of it I don't recall.
No, for sure. So I was having not a debate, but a conversation with a friend about the top 10 TV shows of all time. And at some point we were like, okay, what are the top 10? What's sort of like the consensus on the top 10? And that's clearly difficult to find. And where did we go? We obviously asked ChatGPT. We said, what are the top 10 TV shows of all time? And one of the shows it listed was Chernobyl, and it actually got me thinking. I was like, Chernobyl is a great show, by the way. If you haven't watched it, highly recommend you watch it. A really, really amazing show, but an incredibly dramatized version and super spooky version of what actually happened, right? So you think about that, you have a show that has been, it's labeled one of the great TV shows. So it's out there, people are watching it, it's on HBO, and it is creating this fear. It is create. I mean, if you don't know anything and you watch that show, you will end that season, or you'll end that season thinking, "Wow, like nuclear is really scary." So
Yeah,
kind of
sure.
it's interesting. And then you have movies like the China Syndrome that made whole 3 Mile Island look like a complete disaster. So it
Yeah.
is despite all of
And
these like pop culture elements, it's actually really great to see that there is so much support for nuclear right now.
we've been doing this since the 2040s as a species. Chernobyl is really the one large-scale consequential nuclear energy incident that we've had in the near century that we've been operating nuclear power plants. 3 Mile Island didn't kill anybody. Neither did Fukushima. The deaths attributed to Fukushima were actually in the evacuation itself, not from radiation release, right? So when you actually look at its safety record from a data perspective, it's actually the safest form of energy that we have. So more people are killed installing windmills and installing solar panels, rooftop solar, than in the entirety of the world's nuclear power incidents.
Yeah. And by a lot of different metrics, nuclear wins out from land use efficiency, from deaths per terawatt
Yeah,
hour, all that stuff. But anyway, this is it. We do have a 201 audience, not a 101 audience. So I do want to jump into and talk a little bit about,
sure.
or I should say 301. I'll give them more credit. We have a 301 audience. So let's talk about Antares. Tell us a little bit about sort of core mission, and sort of your business case for Antares, and then tell us a little bit about how you got into this.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, our core mission at Antares, what we're ultimately focused on is how do we generate power in domains where energy is either incredibly scarce, the alternatives can't enable these capabilities, or there is a premium on resilience, on extremely high capacity factors, low sustaining supply chain, specifically use cases that play to the characteristics that only nuclear energy has, right? Um, so primarily defense and space focused in nature. That's kind of our core market. We refer to it as strategic energy. Like, how do we enable the critical mission capabilities that would otherwise be impossible if you didn't have nuclear energy as the power source? And maybe to provide some more color on that, we believe at the sub 1 megawatt scale that we're developing in, there are thousands of candidate assets that we could power just within the defense ecosystem alone. But there are also commercial applications for this technology in mining and oil and gas, remote communities in the Arctic. And then state and local governments have critical infrastructure that need to be prepared to operate under a grid outage or natural disaster as well. The other thing I would say is strategic energy to us is not just about the nuclear power itself. It's about, what is the ultimate value chain that delivers the solution to the problem that the customer is trying to solve? Because they don't want nuclear energy for nuclear energy's sake. They want it because it can uniquely power a missile defense site, right? An Arctic early warning radar system, an ICBM silo, and so. We care deeply about the overall systems integration and being the complete solution to the problem as opposed to just the power source.
Can you just give us a very quick primer? So you said 1 megawatt. Just give us a sense of like, okay, what is in terms for the uninitiated, like what does 1 megawatt mean?
Yeah. So 1 megawatt roughly powers 1,000 homes. And so the way that we think about our market is our base design is scalable, right? We could be 100 kilowatts. We could scale up to a couple 100 kilowatts, but really 200 to 300 kilowatts is the core focus of our product. And then we can put them together modularly if you needed something more like 2 megawatts of power, right? And The motivation behind that is that the majority of DoD critical assets on installations, it's like a bathtub curve if you plot frequency versus power consumption, and the largest segment on there is sub 2 megawatts, and resilience is typically a premium there, right? And so the way you get the most resilient energy, what people think of when they think about resilience in nuclear power, what they typically mean is, um, I am familiar with the capacity factors of the grid scale light water reactors, right? But the 93% capacity factors of the light water reactor fleet still aren't good enough for a lot of these mission sets. You want, to be above 99% capacity factor. The way you do that is through overbuilding, right? Through modular systems. So you have online operations even when you're decommissioning one reactor, and you just use that to drive high uptime and high resilience.
Can you give us just a couple examples of like a high stakes setting where your microreactor would be a game changer?
Yeah, great one. If you think about the totality of homeland missile defense, right? So we have the interceptors themselves that have power requirements. We have the radar sites, the command and control. There's a space-based component of that too. So there are the ground stations. How do you ensure all of that could continue to operate if there was a cyber attack on the civilian grid? Um, if there was some kind of natural disaster like an earthquake or something that took a lot of the civilian grid offline. And this is not just as simple as using a backup diesel generator to solve this problem, because um, in a world where there's no access to commercial power, you can't assume that the military is going to be able to rely on the commercial markets, the commercial diesel supply chains. And furthermore, you don't want the military to be competing with the civilian sector for access to this fuel supply chain that'll also be disrupted in that process, right? And so, it's really just nuclear power provides a resilience that none of the alternatives do. Um, One of the things that is a little unique about us is we're a heat pipe cooled reactor, and the reason we wanted to be there's a couple of reasons why we wanted to do heat pipes. One, it's a technology that's easy to vertically integrate. We can test it iteratively. We make heat pipes in our facility today. But also, heat pipes were a technology that were invented in 1958 for space nuclear power at Los Alamos National Lab. Um, they're in your phone, they're in your laptop, they're in radiators on spacecraft today. It's a ubiquitous technology at lower temperatures. We're really doing it with sodium at the working fluid at high temperatures around 800 C. But we wanted a path to both Earth and space nuclear because we believe there is also an emerging market for military space nuclear power as well to do, really high powered assets, on Earth to defend and deter attack against our strategic military assets on orbit.
So, and then not to get on a tangent, but you're specifically talking about powering a space asset, not necessarily propulsion, right?
There will be both opportunities for power and propulsion. We are more excited about the power side of things, but we're also looking at nuclear electric propulsion as well. So you have both nuclear electric propulsion and nuclear thermal propulsion. Nuclear thermal propulsion you can think of as you're circulating a propellant fluid through a hot nuclear reactor, exhausting it out to create thrust. We're not focused on those applications. You could use that to get to Mars in like half the time.
Yep.
But nuclear electric propulsion, just imagine swapping out a nuclear reactor or swapping in a nuclear reactor as an alternative to a solar power source. And the big benefit you get from that is more efficient use of propellant. But the thing to remember on solar versus nuclear power in space is a nuclear power system scales sublinearly in both mass and volume compared to a solar powered spacecraft. So, the rule of thumb here is if you wanted to do a 100 kilowatt solar powered spacecraft, it's roughly the size of the International Space Station when you consider the size of the panels. Whereas, you can get to 50 to 100 kilowatts electric on a nuclear powered spacecraft with something that could potentially fly on a Falcon 9.
How are you sort of thinking about terrestrial applications? Like, how are you thinking about rolling out these reactors? Are you selling the reactors as a product? Are you planning to operate them in any way? Is there another type of model you're thinking about?
Yeah. So, for us, the business model will evolve over time. So in the early stages for these first couple customer deployments, we want to actually be the operator because we think that's valuable operational data, will make us a better company, will improve the product. And so the pitch is very much like buy reactor asset, we sell services contract on top of that for maintenance and operations. We're getting that valuable data so that we can iterate on the product. When we have more insight, more clarity on what the long-term BOM costs will become, then we want to bring in third-party finance so that we could do things like power purchase agreements as well. But even then, we would still be open to, being the operators on top of that if needed. So it's really a flexible business model in terms of how we deliver this. Certainly a preference in the near term for selling units.
We haven't talked about this yet, but talk a little bit about the fuel supply chain and particularly the fuel that you're using and how you're also navigating around some of the issues around the fuel supply chain.
Yeah, so our preference and what we want to do long term as we commercialize is HALEU, so high assay low enriched uranium, 19.75% enriched U-235. The challenge with that fuel is that today, all of that material is owned in the US, is owned by the US government. We have a ban on foreign imports from Russia. And the US government is allocating that material. So, we expect for some of our successive test reactors to get access to HALEU to be able to test. But we're also planning around, our design being able to go critical for testing purposes with LEU plus as well. So lower enriched material that will be commercially available in 2026.
What is the state? I've heard, obviously there's this pretty significant challenge when it comes to HALEU, both production and also just obtaining it. Period, just based on sort of the way the regulation exists today. How do you see that evolving? What is the current sort of state of the fuel production in the U.S. and how do you see that evolving? I guess during this administration.
So the state of play right now is we have no licensed commercial enrichers to HALEU levels inside of, or to 1975 max HALEU level in the U.S. right now, and Centrus is making material today under a DOE-funded contract that the DOE is then allocating to developers who are doing demonstration reactors or the advanced reactor demonstration program. There are a number of startups that are now working to get licensed to do HALEU. Some of that was announced under the HALEU availability program that the DOE just funded to the tune of $2.7 billion. So there's been this bottleneck in the market for this fuel for some time now, really since the war in Ukraine started. One of the things as a result of the president's recent executive orders that we expect to change is the DoD will now have a program of record for nuclear power on DoD installations. And the DoD has the capability through the NNSA to downblend highly enriched uranium down to HALEU quantities today. And in fact, they've already done that for existing programs. And so the way the shape of the market looks right now is that the DoD will be the first, first mover customer for advanced nuclear, which was, the customer constituency that we started this business to serve in the first place. And we're expecting as a part of this program that they will likely use material that they already have on hand to, basically cross that chasm until the commercial market comes online.
Got it. And then as far as safety is concerned, how are you? I mean, you're placing these reactors in what could be contested environments. Like what? Talk about how you're thinking about safety.
The use cases that we're primarily designing around are actually largely based here in the U.S. homeland. And so these are already secure installations with a security workforce. We have not really been designing to date around going into war zones per se.
Okay.
So think, our, great example would be think about our early warning radar sites across the North Slope of Alaska. There are also remote communities in Alaska that could benefit from nuclear power as well. Those kind of assets that primarily serve the homeland that are in either remote environments, or environments that just place a premium on resilience are primarily what we're focused on.
Should we be putting reactors in contested environments?
It's a controversial question. It's something the DoD has looked at quite a bit. And what I would say is there are use cases that make sense and there are ones that don't. Also, it fundamentally depends on what your definition of contested is, right? But
Sure.
submarines are underwater in contested environments and they're nuclear powered.
Yep. Yep.
Um, you could imagine a nuclear powered marine vessel that's doing ship to shore power to an
Yeah.
island installation where we're doing sortie generation.
Yeah.
So there are certainly use cases that make more sense than others. Another one is nuclear power in space. We could argue that space is now a contested environment. In fact, I would argue that, but um, there aren't people near these systems, right?
Yeah, yeah, and most of the time, I refer to these sound bites that I've heard in the past, which is when folks compare diesel fuel and in a war in Afghanistan and troop death, and say, well, if we plop down a microreactor on the battlefield scenario, it would solve all these issues. But obviously, it's far more complicated than just kind of the way some of these. That threat sometimes is unveiled.
Well,
so
yeah, totally. I mean, here's the thing that ultimately drives that is you need both gamma and neutron shielding for these systems, right? That is heavy, massive material, hard to transport, and so fundamentally, even at kilowatt scale, these systems, while you can relocate them, they end up being relocatable in the same way that like a missile defense site is like a THAAD battery is relocatable. It's not something that moves on short notice unless it's marine borne, because you just need a lot of shielding mass to be able to keep people safe around it, right? And that's why, by the way, we believe the first market, and by the way, the largest market for DoD nuclear power, will be powering strategic assets that exist on our installations today.
Right. What are the hardest sort of technical challenges you still need to solve to get your reactor operational? And maybe talk, you're using a heat pipe mechanism. Talk a little bit about how novel that is versus technology that's already been tested and proven and showcased already.
Well, we would certainly argue that heat pipes are a high technology readiness technology. They're low manufacturing readiness in terms of the commercial supply chain for high temperature heat pipes like what we're doing. So there are companies that are doing, one-off sodium, potassium, lithium heat pipes for primarily research applications. We're really the first company that's saying we're going to vertically integrate this, solve the manufacturing readiness challenge ourselves by developing and testing and qualifying these systems ourselves. So, kind of key hardware challenge with any nuclear reactor design is validating the performance of your primary coolant into your primary heat exchanger, right? And so we're actually going through a test campaign for this now, where we've built an electrically heated prototype. It's operating at NASA Marshall in Huntsville, Alabama. We partnered with them under a Space Act agreement. And essentially what we've done is taken our reactor design, put cartridge heaters into the graphite, into where the fuel channels would be, heat up the graphite, our heat pipes move the heat out, and then nitrogen flows through the heat exchanger, simulating the power conversion system. And so we instrument the heat transfer performance end to end and validate the performance of our subsystems. We will see areas where what we see in the real world deviates from what we modeled and simulated in-house, and that'll drive minor changes in our design, where then we go machine new graphite in-house, we make new heat pipes of a new heat pipe design in-house, and then we iterate towards another electrically heated prototype. So that hardware testing is core to the design process itself for us. In terms of the other technology challenges, developing, qualifying, testing our reactivity control system. So a future electrically heated prototype will include our control system. And then the other one is developing a power conversion system. So we rely on a nitrogen Brayton cycle to convert heat into electricity. We're partnered with an incredible supply partner on that and co-developing that system with them. But eventually we'll develop and test that electrically heated as well. So one of the cool things about this approach, where hardware is part of the design process itself, you qualify these systems as you go. By the time we turn on our first of a kind reactor in 2027, it will look more like an nth of a kind system from a performance perspective. But even then, we plan to iterate through multiple successive test reactors as part of our development.
So when will you produce your first electron?
We're targeting before end of year 2027 in partnership with Idaho National Lab.
And how much capital will it take for you to get there? If you can give us some kind of magnitude.
Yeah, in totality, getting to the point of producing a first electron will have been about $150 million.
Got it. And that's a pretty substantial. Now, obviously, this is not a gigawatt scale reactor, but I mean, this is a substantial cost or magnitude lower than what we've seen in the past. Or how do you quantify that number?
What we're doing to get to a first of a kind is orders of magnitude lower than what you see the gigawatt scale reactor developers taking to get to a first of a kind, right? I mean, first of a kind AP1000, billions and billions of dollars to get to that, right? Now, the interesting thing about what we're doing in our partnership with Idaho National Lab is the design maturity, the regulatory maturity, the safety basis development that we're doing with this first reactor will support the testing of a second reactor and eventually a third reactor on a much more iterative and cheaper cash requirement than the first one did. So we expect those numbers to actually go down substantially as we go from first of a kind to nth of a kind.
So let's talk a little bit about competition. It's very exciting for all the reasons we talked about earlier, but there are a lot of advanced reactor startups out there, and all pursuing somewhat different strategies. How do you sort of compare your approach versus others? And is there a world where everyone can succeed? Because ultimately, this is a power generation problem. If you look at any estimate of how much power we need, it's like, despite whatever build out and projection we have for build out, there's just an enormous need for power versus what we can supply over the next, call it, 10 years.
So, the president's recent executive orders call for a quadrupling of nuclear power in the coming decades. The reality is, even all of the companies in the space today, I don't even think are equipped to produce to that number alone, right? So there's a lot of design maturity and technical development that will have to happen in order to meet those targets. In terms of the competitive landscape, we are really the only company that is going after this specific market where we've been extremely thoughtful around the mission architectures that we want to design around to be able to serve. Some companies are targeting, things like AI data centers, and those are much larger reactors, right? Or, they want to be alternatives to diesel generators, and those pose a very different set of materials challenges in order to get nuclear power cheap enough to go compete in those markets, right? When you consider the total life cycle cost. What I would say just within the DoD market and commercial critical infrastructure market alone, we sort of look at our production scaling like into the early to mid 2030s. We could get between 150 to 200 units a year of production. The market out there is much bigger than that. So, us, our competitors, virtually everybody will be production constrained before they're constrained by the size of the market or competitive intensity. The other thing I would say is, the market that you pick really drives your technical challenges and what will need to go into maturing your product, right? And so everybody today is focused on, how do I get to a first of a kind? How do I show the tech is real so that I can start commercializing? But what's ultimately going to happen as us and some of our competitors turn our first test reactors on is the development will become much more metrics driven, right? How do you optimize the thermal efficiency of your Brayton cycle? How do you optimize the capacity factors of these systems? Whose design can really get them to that, and how much capital will you need to spend to iterate to get to a mature product? So that's one of what we see as our natural advantages, is because we chose the market where it's very small scale power generation. We will be able to iterate and develop iteratively with sums of money that are raisable with venture capital.
So let's look beyond the U.S. Like, how big of a problem is China, or maybe asked differently, how far ahead are they versus the U.S., both on a technological development perspective and then on the regulatory side?
It pains me to say this, but it's unfortunately a really big problem. So China has something like 31 grid scale reactors under construction right now. They have small scale test reactors operating, one that turned on just within the last few months in Inner Mongolia. They have a Gen 4 high temperature gas reactor operating on the grid right now that's TRISO fueled. I think they've approved 10 new reactors for construction just in the first half of this year alone. We have 0 grid scale reactors under construction right now in this country. And, I think one of the things that's maybe the most painful of all is that most of the underlying intellectual property, most of the research and development that underpins these systems was done here in the US at our nuclear energy labs at our universities. And so, um, it's an incredibly tough spot to be in. But I think the silver lining behind this is the Chinese are showing us that we can do this, right? The tech that we invented here in this country works. And, we really need commercial industry and private capital to step up to fill those gaps. I mean, the big difference between the Chinese approach and the American approach to this technology is the Chinese approach is, whole of government, right? Like the state backs all of these initiatives from start to finish, and they're really the guarantor of these projects, right? That's not how we operate in the U.S. We're much more of a free market, private capital ecosystem, and so we have to go through these development programs to commercialize this technology, and through competition in the market, designs will win out, and it'll consolidate over time.
How are you approaching the regulatory landscape in the U.S.?
For our first test reactors, they're being licensed under the DOE 1189 technical standard at Idaho National Lab. We also want to develop an NRC licensed test facility where we could do an NRC licensed test reactor that we would be able to operate ourselves as well. Now, we see one of the things that was made clear in these executive orders that the president has signed is the DoD will license DoD nuclear reactors on DoD installations, and the Army will be the executive agent for that. And so, we really see a couple really unique opportunities inside of that. So, one is we're developing these test reactors under the DOE standard. Well, that same DOE regulatory workforce, the same technical experts at Idaho National Lab already support the DoD on reactor initiatives. And so they could provide the technical support. People who are already familiar with our design, with other companies' designs, can provide the technical support to license these reactors on DoD installations. And that could be, we certainly believe, it will be a much faster path to market for these first commercial reactors. One of the things I will call out is the DoD has licensed a test reactor. Actually, it's a nuclear weapons effects test reactor, fast burst reactor, relicensed it as recently as 2016 using the Army Reactors Authority that already exists. So that Army Reactors licensing authority dates all the way back to the Atomic Energy Act, and they've used it a number of times throughout the years.
So the feeling I'm getting, Jordan, from the way I guess you're talking about the executive orders, is that you do feel like that there's going to be meaningful change that comes out of these orders. Because I've also heard the perspective and opinion from others that have felt like it's going to just be it's more bark than bite. Like where do you stand on the ultimate impact of the EOs?
I mean, what I would say is we're living it every single day, right? So, we're in conversations with the Department of Energy, with the Nuclear Energy National Labs on a daily basis. We can already see how they are responding to these executive orders and changes that they are making in order to get these systems built more efficiently, more quickly, in order to meet the president's intent. So I would just say from what we've observed empirically, things are already improving. And then, I think ultimately people's interpretation of these executive orders are going to be based upon what they hope to get out of them for their market, right? We fundamentally believe that nuclear energy is a national security matter. The DoD needs nuclear power for mission continuity, mission assurance, and having a DoD licensing standard and a program of record to sell into is going to be a massive enabler for this market opportunity, right? So that's ultimately what we're excited about: more efficient DOE 1189 licensing. Hopefully that results in more staffing at the national labs focused on getting these privately funded reactors online and making sure the developers get the level of attention that they need. Um, but yeah, I mean, for us, it was like Christmas morning. I think this is a once in a lifetime opportunity for nuclear power is how we view it.
What do you think will happen to the structure of the NRC? Any predictions?
Don't know. Too early to tell. But the number one thing that was highlighted in the executive orders that folks are most keyed into is an 18-month response time on reactor applications, on licensing applications. So, the interesting thing, I mean, I think, look, the way to interpret these is there should no longer be the regulatory excuse for why nuclear power is not being built and deployed in this country. Now it is on us as developers to get our tech out there into the market. I think, one thing that you'll see from many of these NRC engagements from many of the companies is that the reality is their design just isn't mature enough yet. They haven't actually, simulated and modeled all of the transient scenarios. They haven't actually done all of the materials testing necessary to support their licensing case. And NRC turnaround times are probably going to turn out to be less of an issue than people may have thought they were. That would be my prediction.
You talk to a lot of investors, and there's clearly a vibe shift, for lack of a better word, around how investors are thinking about nuclear. Like, what have you seen? Like, because historically nuclear has been viewed as this like high capex, like definitely not a venture, an area where venture capitalists should be, right? Long timelines, oftentimes over budget. Like, do you think we're witnessing sort of a renaissance when it comes to like, the ability for venture capitalists to make a difference in what's happening in nuclear?
Well, we definitely are. And I think there's this recognition from capital markets now that like $50 billion market cap businesses will be built in this category. Certainly some of the products we discussed, grid scale nuclear, really are not a fit for venture finance. I mean, frankly, some of those products I think will be hard to mature without significant public support. But certainly in the microreactor market, what you're raising venture capital for is product development that you then go and commercialize and site units with customers, and they look, over time the P&L looks just like any other manufacturing business. In our market, in particular, where we're really focused on enabling and selling the mission effect as opposed to just selling the electricity. These things could look more like space launch, where you've got 60% gross margin systems and high contribution margin on what you're selling. Still capex intensive to build a business like that, but I think one lesson of venture capital in maybe the last decade or so is when you look at the biggest venture capital outcomes of all, they may not have been high capex, but most of them were very, very, very high opex. And at the end of the day, that still results in dilution. And so the alternatives that people thought were maybe less dilutive actually turned out to be highly dilutive. And you look at businesses like SpaceX that took something like $7 billion in capital to be worth $100 billion. It's not unlike Uber or DoorDash that raised similar amounts of money to build businesses of that size. So I think people are recognizing the fact that these manufacturing businesses are some of the biggest in the world. Just generational companies, tens of billions of dollars of market cap will be created in this space between now and the 2030s. And so, it's funny, when we were raising a seed round, I think there were some investors that we met with who felt like investing in nuclear energy would be hard to sell to their LPs. Now we're seeing it the other way around, where we've had investors who have privately told us their LPs are asking them when they're going to make a nuclear investment.
And that all happened in a very short period of time. So, look, I do have to ask you, like, on a personal level, right? Building a nuclear reactor is not a trivial pursuit, right? It's incredibly challenging technically. It's challenging from navigating regulation. It's challenging from like selling into government. On a personal level, like what's driving you? What drives you to work on this problem?
Yeah. So, there are technical answers to that, and then there are maybe even more deeper personal answers. But when I look at what is the intersection between like my superpowers and what I just love doing every single day, it's complex systems problems, right? Like, one of our values here at this company is think in systems. And that's this recognition that like every change you make at one place in the design has this rippling effect throughout the rest of the design. So, you make a small materials change so that you get better neutronics properties in the reactor. How does that affect your manufacturability? What does that do to the supply chain? And I just find like these like complex systems problems at the intersection of like physics and techno-economics to just be fascinating. They motivate me. I obsess over them every single day. So just the whole process of doing it is just something that I've fallen in love with. But then I would another thing for me is I deliberately wanted to do something extremely hard, to prove to myself I could do it, to make a big impact, to just do something substantial and important. And I think the other big thing that motivates me is like we said earlier, like this technology will be part of decarbonizing our power supply. It will expand humanity's presence in space. It'll drive great national security outcomes. I can't think of one technology that allows you to do all of those three incredibly ambitious, incredibly like nationally strategic things every single day. I have a 2.5-year-old son. I think a lot about how will he view me when he's a teenager? What world will he be inheriting? Like, what am I doing now to make America and the world a better place that he's inheriting as he comes of age? And over time, that's actually become much more of a powerful motivator for me too.
Yeah, very well said. What do you say to people who are still afraid of nuclear?
Well, I would probably just echo something that we said earlier, which I think people are scared of things that are rare and the risks are poorly understood. We don't tend to fear the things that are ubiquitous and the risks are well understood, right? And so, as these technologies mature, as we deploy more and more of them, what we'll see is that they're fundamentally safe. They have the best safety record of any power generation technology. When you compare them to other technologies like automobiles, commercial aviation, the safety record beats that as well. And I think over time, as it becomes commercially ubiquitous, people will become more and more comfortable with it.
Yeah, well said, Jordan. Thanks so much for being on the show. This is great. It was a pleasure. Really, really great to hear your perspective. It is certainly a very, very exciting time to be in nuclear. We just actually held a summit in New York, which I know you were a part of, and the energy and the excitement and all the feedback we've gotten, especially from investors, actually, most importantly, which there's so many critical, there's so much capital that's going to be needed across the board, across all of these technologies, and the level of investor interest, and especially the types of investors who are leaning in. Even the investment banks are leaning in and heavily focused on figuring out how to finance all this. It's great. It's really good to see.
Awesome. Well, hey, thank you so much for having me. Totally agree with everything you said, and it's really exciting to do this, and hopefully we get to do it again sometime.
Yep. Until next time. Thanks, Jordan.